What would you do if the person who just broke your heart handed you a microphone and asked you to sing a song about it in front of millions? That's not a metaphor. That's exactly what happened to Agnetha Faltskog, the golden-haired voice of ABBA. When her marriage to Björn Ulvaeus collapsed, he wrote a song about it. A song that mourned the loss, that celebrated the winner, and left the loser to carry the tune. That song became a global sensation. And Agnetha? She had to sing it on stage, night after night, with the man who had just moved on. So let me ask you, where does performance end and exploitation begin? Welcome back to Tragedy Uncovered, the channel that doesn't settle for headlines. We peel back the layers, dig into what fame hides, and let the uncomfortable truths echo long after the applause fades. If you believe in looking beyond the curtain, in questioning the price of glittering success, subscribe now and join us. Because what you're about to hear is not the story they put in documentaries. This is the story of ABBA, the group that defined an era, but quietly disintegrated under the weight of its own emotional wreckage. Most people remember the sequins, the anthems, the musicals, but few know that behind the harmonies were two shattered marriages, silent battles with mental health, bitter silences, public humiliations, and offers so astronomical they defied logic and were still turned down. Today, we're not here to praise or vilify. We're here to confront, to explore how four people, bonded by love and ambition, became prisoners of a global phenomenon they couldn't escape even when they no longer wanted to sing together. ABBA wasn't just a band. It was two couples, Agnetha and Björn, Benny and Frida, lovers who built an empire and tried to keep performing as if their emotional lives weren't crumbling behind the scenes. Ask yourself, could you keep working side by side with your ex-spouse, touring the world, faking joy, and singing about heartbreak, knowing the lyrics were written to immortalize your pain? This is not about fame fading. This is about personal erosion disguised as professional endurance. This is about how media and fans alike, perhaps unintentionally, applauded a tragedy unfolding in slow motion because the music was just that good. In the coming segments, we'll trace the timeline from Eurovision glory to the final broadcast. We'll dive deep into how ABBA rose like a phoenix from the ashes of commercial failure only to be consumed from within. We'll examine the roles of the members not as pop stars, but as human beings, fragile, fallible, and at times, deeply damaged. We'll confront the patterns, romantic betrayal, psychological breakdowns, the eerie calm of professional polish masking emotional collapse. And we'll ask the questions the industry rarely wants to answer. Why did Björn move on so quickly? Why did Agnetha keep performing despite her terror of flying and signs of depression? Why did Frida's supposedly fairy tale wedding implode? Why did they all refuse a $1 billion reunion offer in 2000 and amount more than the GDP of small countries? Most of all, we'll ask this: when does a performance stop being an act and start being a cry for help? So if you think you know ABBA, think again, because this is the side of their story that wasn't choreographed. The side where love songs were funeral dirges, where glitter hid grief, and where the winner takes it all might just be the saddest hit ever sung. Back in 1973, their first shot at stardom came with a catchy tune called Ring Ring. It had all the makings of a pop hit: infectious melody, bright harmonies, and a cheerful innocence. But when they entered it into Melodifestivalen, the Swedish competition that determined who would represent the country at Eurovision, the song only placed third. It was a gut punch for a band desperately hoping for exposure. Failing to even qualify for the international stage was more than disappointing, it was humiliating. But instead of giving up, they recalibrated. There's something remarkable about the resilience they displayed during that time. Most bands, especially those deeply entangled romantically, would have folded under the pressure. But ABBA pushed forward. They took the failure of Ring Ring and used it as fuel. The next year, in 1974, they returned to Melodifestivalen with Waterloo, a song so daring, so vibrant. It practically demanded attention. And attention it got. Not only did ABBA win the Swedish selection, they went on to perform Waterloo at the Eurovision Song Contest in Brighton. On April 6, 1974, they captivated an entire continent. Their flamboyant outfits, their high-energy choreography, and their pure pop brilliance flipped the script. Waterloo wasn't just a song, it was a declaration. Sweden had arrived, and ABBA was its voice. The world responded. The single shot up the charts across Europe, from the UK to West Germany, to South Africa, and even across the Atlantic in the United States. This wasn't just a win. This was ignition. But fame, as always, comes with conditions. With Waterloo, ABBA achieved the international recognition they had craved. But success brought expectations, and expectations became pressure. The media began watching their every move. Industry insiders whispered that they were a one-hit wonder in the making. Could they follow it up? Could they sustain that level of attention without imploding? Their next single, Honey, Honey, performed modestly. Meanwhile, their UK label made the questionable decision to re-release Ring Ring, the very song that had failed to launch them the first time. Predictably, it fell flat. Sales were soft, and the momentum wobbled. That's when ABBA decided to tour. In November of 1974, they launched their first major European tour, hoping to solidify their presence in the live music scene. But the results were disappointing, almost cruelly so. In cities like West Germany, Denmark, and Austria, ticket sales were abysmal. Shows were canceled due to low turnout. The very countries that had helped Waterloo climb the charts now seemed disinterested in seeing the band live. Behind the scenes, that rejection cut deep. Not just professionally but personally. Because at that moment, the band wasn't just four performers. They were two couples trying to raise children, navigate fame, and survive emotionally. Agnetha and Bjorn had recently become parents. Frida and Benny were both raising kids from previous marriages. Touring meant separation from their children, a guilt that hung over them. Unspoken but heavy. Frida, in particular, would later reveal the toll it took on her psyche, describing how she struggled with depression during this time and questioned whether she was fit to be a mother while battling her own internal storms. But they kept going. The second leg of the tour took them back home to Scandinavia. And there, the tides turned. In Stockholm, they performed in front of over 19,000 fans. The crowd's energy was electrifying. It was validation. Proof that, despite what the rest of Europe thought, ABBA's music resonated. And not just because of catchy tunes, but because it tapped into something joyful, something universal. Yet within the band, something had started to change. Bjorn would later reflect on this period with striking honesty. He admitted that after Waterloo, they tried too hard to adapt to trends leaning toward glam rock aesthetics and moving away from their pop roots. It didn't suit them. The band lost its identity momentarily, trying to chase a sound that wasn't theirs. And in doing so, they began losing touch with themselves. This was the first crack, not a collapse, but a warning sign. The kind of subtle shift that doesn't make headlines, but in hindsight, marks the beginning of erosion. Meanwhile, their manager, Stig Anderson, was working behind the scenes with laser focus. He understood that to keep ABBA on top, they needed more than just good music, they needed strategic exposure. That's when the idea of music videos as a substitute for physical touring emerged. It was a novel concept then, especially for international markets like Australia, which were geographically isolated. ABBA embraced the format with enthusiasm. Their videos aired regularly on Countdown, an Australian TV program, and the result was explosive. Suddenly, Australia couldn't get enough of ABBA. They dominated the charts. Their records flew off the shelves. The group became pop royalty in a country they had barely stepped foot in. But fame from afar is deceptive. While the videos showed polished performances and smiling faces, behind the scenes, the strain was building. Relationships within the group were still intact for now, but the pressures of fame, touring, parenthood, and constant scrutiny were beginning to pile up. They were no longer just artists. They were icons expected to shine at all times, no matter what personal anguish they carried. And it wouldn't be long before those personal lives began to unravel, publicly. By the late 1970s, ABBA was riding high in terms of global success. But as we peel back the image of polished perfection, a different story comes into focus, one of fraying connections, emotional exhaustion, and quiet desperation hiding behind rehearsed smiles. This is where the true human side of ABBA begins to break through the surface. Because for all their glittering harmonies, ABBA wasn't just four professional musicians. They were four human beings deeply entangled emotionally, romantically, psychologically, and for two of them, those entanglements were starting to come undone. Let's start with Agnetha Falskog. She was the voice that defined many of ABBA's biggest hits. Blonde, photogenic, and poised, she quickly became the face of the band. But that face masked a soul increasingly fractured by the cost of fame. Agnetha never asked to become a sex symbol, but media outlets, especially in places like Australia, zeroed in on her physical appearance with a level of scrutiny that bordered on dehumanizing. At one concert in 1977, she wore a fitted white jumpsuit, a bold but standard stage outfit for the time. The next morning, a headline read, "Agnetha's Bottom Tops Dull Show." That wasn't music journalism. That was public objectification, and it left scars. Agnetha later reflected on this with a quiet bitterness, questioning whether Australia had ever seen a woman's body before. But the damage was deeper than sarcasm could heal. Being reduced to anatomy in front of millions isn't just embarrassing. It erodes your sense of self-worth, especially when you're already battling the intense pressure of motherhood, anxiety, and the rigors of touring. Her relationship with Bjorn Ulvaeus was already on fragile ground. They had married young and had a child together. But as ABBA's star rose, their personal lives were pushed further and further to the background. Fame can bind people in ambition, but it often erodes the intimacy that relationships need to survive. By 1979, the inevitable happened. Agnetha and Bjorn divorced. Publicly, they called it an amicable split. But behind closed doors, the emotional fallout was far more painful. Just a week after the separation, Bjorn was seen with another woman. The optics were jarring. For fans, it was a curiosity. For Agnetha, it was a humiliation. It didn't matter how many albums they sold or how beloved they were, she was now expected to stand on stage with a man who had so quickly moved on, sing lyrics about heartbreak, and act as though nothing had changed. And in a way, she did. Because right after the breakup, ABBA released The Winner Takes It All, a haunting ballad that became one of their most successful songs and one of the most emotionally complex pieces in pop history. The lyrics tell a story of someone left behind, someone trying to process the cold finality of love lost. Bjorn wrote it, Agnetha sang it, and millions listened, many unaware they were witnessing a real emotional reckoning disguised as a performance. Critics speculated wildly about the meaning. Was it autobiographical? Was it cruel? Was it closure? Agnetha's answer years later was striking in its honesty. She admitted the song resonated deeply not just with her, but with all four members. Because by then, even the other couple, Benny and Frida, were starting to fall apart too. But before we get to that, let's understand Benny Andersson and Annie Frid Lyngstad. Frida, as she was known, had a stormy past of her own. Born in wartime Norway and raised by her grandmother, she had survived early trauma and rejection. By the time she joined ABBA, she was already a seasoned performer and a mother. Her relationship with Benny was long-standing but complex. They were together for a decade before deciding to marry in 1978, a decision many believed was symbolic of a moment of unity as the other couple was disintegrating. But that unity didn't last. While Agnetha and Bjorn were trying to maintain a working relationship post-divorce, a nearly impossible task, Frida and Benny were quietly drifting apart. Touring schedules, fame, and emotional wear and tear all played their part. By 1980, they were separated. In 1981, their divorce was official. Benny, like Bjorn before him, didn't wait long before remarrying. Frida's response wasn't public, but her silence spoke volumes. So let's pause and consider the situation by the early 1980s. ABBA was still functioning as a band, still recording, still producing music. But underneath, all the romantic ties had been severed. The group that had once sung about love, hope, and partnership was now running on fumes, not emotionally, but logistically. They were fulfilling obligations, delivering performances. But the joy that once fueled the project had been replaced by tension, silence, and unspoken grief. What makes this even more tragic is that their artistry didn't suffer. In fact, many critics argue that their post-breakup work is their most mature and emotionally resonant. Albums like Super Trooper and The Visitors revealed a darker, more reflective side of the group. Songs like One of Us and When All Is Said and Done weren't just pop singles, they were personal eulogies. And yet, the public barely noticed. Fans still saw them as the glitzy quartet with matching outfits and danceable hits. The reality was much more raw. ABBA had become a shell of its former self, still beautiful, still harmonious, but hollowed out from within. This wasn't just a band falling apart. It was a family unraveling under the gaze of the world. By the time ABBA released The Visitors in 1981, the fractures that once ran quietly beneath the surface were now deep and unmistakable. The album itself, often regarded as their most introspective and sonically mature, felt like a farewell letter set to music. And yet, no formal announcement came. No press release. No breakup tour. Just silence. Which leads us to the next unsettling question. Why did ABBA disappear without a sound? Bands break up all the time. Some implode spectacularly. Others burn out in slow motion. But ABBA's exit was different, chillingly quiet. After performing on the Late Late Breakfast show in December 1982, they simply stopped. No encore. No emotional goodbye. Just four people who once shared their lives, now walking separate roads. There's an old saying, the loudest screams are the ones no one hears. ABBA's silence was deafening. It's here that we must confront the hidden toll of emotional endurance, especially when it's performed for profit. Because make no mistake, ABBA continued as long as they did not out of love or camaraderie, but out of obligation. Contractual, financial, and public pressure kept them smiling, singing, and showing up even when the spark had long vanished. But at what cost? Let's revisit The Winner Takes It All for a moment. It's easy to admire the craftsmanship, the haunting melody, the vulnerability in Agnetha's voice. But consider the context again. A woman singing a song written by her ex-husband, mere months after their divorce, in front of a global audience that interpreted it as entertainment. Was it empowering? Was it cruel? Or was it something more disturbing, a moment where real grief was commodified, where personal heartbreak became pop culture fodder? And it wasn't just that one song. ABBA's final era was filled with lyrical clues. One of Us told the story of someone left behind. When All Is Said and Done echoed a breakup's quiet devastation. These weren't just clever metaphors. They were emotional confessions. wrapped in catchy choruses the only way the group could scream without being accused of falling apart. So why didn't the media catch on? That question lingers. Part of the answer lies in the image ABBA so carefully maintained: cheerful, clean-cut, glamorous. Unlike rock bands who reveled in chaos, ABBA built their legacy on control and polish. No tabloid outbursts, no public meltdowns, no messy feuds. But that very perfection became its own prison. When they finally needed empathy, what they got was silence. The world wasn't ready to see them bleed. And perhaps that's why they never publicly addressed their disbandment. There was nothing left to prove. No narrative left to uphold. They had already laid themselves bare through music, and no one had really listened. But the unanswered questions go even deeper. Take Benny and Frida's relationship. Why did their marriage collapse so quickly after tying the knot in 1978? Was it doomed from the start? A symbolic gesture made in the shadow of Bjorn and Agnetha's divorce? Or was there something else beneath the surface: resentment, infidelity, exhaustion that no one dared to talk about? Benny's swift remarriage, just months after his divorce from Frida, raised eyebrows. But in the world of ABBA, decorum ruled. No public statements, no tell-all interviews, just a quiet reordering of lives and a sense of emotional whiplash for anyone paying close attention. And then there's the 1979 incident in the U.S. During a short flight from New York to Boston, the band experienced a terrifying mid-air emergency due to a tornado threat. They had to make an emergency landing. And while the headlines moved on quickly, Agnetha did not. She became terrified of flying. And from that point on, touring became increasingly difficult. For a global band, this wasn't just a logistical challenge, it was a death sentence. How do you maintain worldwide fame if one of your lead singers can no longer travel? This detail, often treated as a footnote, actually reveals a pivotal moment in ABBA's unraveling. Behind every canceled tour or delayed album was a very human cause: anxiety, trauma, fatigue. But the industry didn't have a language for those things in the early 80s, especially not when the faces involved were female. And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what really made them walk away in 1982? Many point to exhaustion. Others believe they simply outgrew the format. But could it also be that ABBA, having shared their deepest emotional wounds through music, had nothing left to give? Not because they lacked creativity, but because they had given too much already? It's not dramatic to say ABBA bled for their art. But unlike bands that self-destruct publicly, ABBA did something even more painful. They endured in silence. Until there was no more silence left to endure, they were offered a way back. In the year 2000, a consortium offered them $1 billion, that's billion with a B, to reunite for 100 shows. To put that into perspective, each member stood to make more than the net worth of many A-list celebrities combined. But they said no. Not because they didn't need the money, but because they finally recognized something the world hadn't. ABBA was no longer a band. It was a scar. To go back would mean reopening wounds they had spent decades trying to heal. No amount of applause could fix that. So they stayed apart. And the world moved on for a while. As we follow the quiet disintegration of ABBA, another layer of the story emerges, one that doesn't belong solely to the band, but to us, to the audience, to the press, to the millions of fans who adored the sound but overlooked the silence between the notes. Because while ABBA was unraveling behind the scenes, the world was still clapping. That contradiction raises an uncomfortable question. Did we, as a society, choose to ignore their suffering because it was easier to consume the illusion? Let's look at the public response during those final years. On the surface, it was overwhelmingly positive. Their albums were still selling. Their songs remained staples on radio. Music videos aired on TV stations across continents. The faces were the same. The harmonies still pristine, and for most people, that was enough. Few paused to notice that the sparkle in their eyes was gone, that the lyrics were no longer lighthearted, that the group who once sang "Take a Chance on Me" had shifted toward "Slipping Through My Fingers." It wasn't denial. It was a kind of cultural conditioning. We had filed ABBA under happy music, so when the tone changed, we didn't question why. We simply danced anyway. But the media? They had no excuse. Journalists, critics, entertainment reporters, they all covered ABBA extensively. Yet the majority chose to focus on shallow angles, costumes, choreography, record sales. Even in moments of vulnerability like Agnetha's visible discomfort with press conferences or her resistance to travel coverage remained superficial. She doesn't like flying. They'd write. Never. She might be suffering from trauma. The most glaring example of this blindness came during the Australian tour in 1977. While fans were practically hysterical with excitement, the press was laser-focused on Agnetha's appearance. A concert performance drenched in rain, delivered to a crowd of thousands, was reduced to a headline about her backside. That moment wasn't just misogynistic. It was symbolic of the way ABBA's personal narratives were dismissed in favor of image-driven entertainment. In a different context, such media treatment might have triggered outrage. But not with ABBA. They were too clean, too polished, too marketable. Journalists didn't want a scandal. They wanted sparkle. And ABBA kept providing it even as they were breaking down inside. And what about the fans? The truth is, fans adored ABBA deeply. Their music touched millions. But admiration often comes with assumptions, especially about strength. Many fans believed that because the band continued working, they must be fine. They assumed that singing together after divorces meant maturity. That releasing songs about heartbreak was just good songwriting, not lived experience. Some fans even romanticized the pain. The Winner Takes It All became an anthem. People slow danced to it, sang along to it, used it in weddings and TV shows, never realizing that it was the sound of a woman standing next to her ex-husband, reliving her pain one verse at a time. In some ways, the public was complicit, not maliciously but passively. We rewarded ABBA for pretending everything was fine. We preferred the fantasy of four Swedes in harmony over the truth of four individuals quietly falling apart. And when they finally disappeared, we didn't demand answers. We let them vanish, just like we had ignored the warning signs. But here's where the real reckoning begins. ABBA's story is not just about a band. It's about how we treat emotional labor in the public eye. How we expect artists to turn their pain into performance, to smile through despair, to stay grateful no matter how much they're suffering. We do this with actors, with athletes, with anyone who dares to be visible. And ABBA was one of the earliest, most elegant casualties of that dynamic. We applauded their resilience without asking what it cost them. Even in recent decades, as interest in the band has resurfaced through musicals like Mamma Mia or hologram concerts, the narrative remains scrubbed clean. The heartbreak is stylized. The grief is choreographed. And the members themselves are rarely asked how it really felt. This selective memory sanitizes a history that was far more complicated. It turns the visitors an album drenched in sorrow and reflection into background music at shopping malls. It reduces knowing me, knowing you, to a karaoke staple, forgetting that it was written as a couple was splitting in real time. To this day, Agnetha is still asked about her appearance in old videos. Bjorn is asked how he managed to stay so professional after the divorce. These aren't real questions. They're shallow praise disguised as curiosity, the same surface-level thinking that let their pain go unnoticed for years. We need to ask better questions, not just of ABBA, but of ourselves. What do we really want from our artists? Is it fair to demand they remain emotionally available while emotionally destroyed? Can we truly celebrate their vulnerability if we refuse to acknowledge its origin? And maybe most crucially, if ABBA hadn't kept up the performance, if they had broken down publicly, if they had shouted or sobbed or disappeared overnight, would we still love them the same way? That uncertainty is at the heart of ABBA's tragedy, because they never gave us the scandal. They never melted down on live TV. They never lashed out or betrayed each other publicly. Instead, they swallowed their sorrow. They turned it into melody. They harmonized through heartbreak and left us to dance to it, never realizing what we were really hearing. So where does that leave us? After 5 parts of unraveling ABBA's legacy, it becomes clear this was never just a story about music. It was a slow-motion emotional detonation, publicly packaged as pop history, a band that gave the world disco highs while silently drowning in private lows, a global phenomenon that didn't explode, but dissolved and did so with a grace so quiet. Most people didn't hear the sound of it breaking. Their decision not to announce a breakup wasn't cowardice. It was restraint, perhaps even mercy for themselves, for their audience. What could they have said that hadn't already been sung? ABBA never screamed for help. They never issued a statement pleading for understanding. Instead, they laced their pain into every note of their final albums. The songs were subdued, the chords darker, the production stripped of the glitter. You could feel the distance between the members, not physically, but emotionally. It's in the cold, echoing background of the visitors. It's in the sharp, resigned lyrics of when all is said and done. It's in the tonal shift from exuberant celebration to melancholy closure. And we, as listeners, danced anyway. Years passed. The 80s turned to the 90s. The music landscape changed. Synths faded. Grunge rose. Then faded again. And yet, ABBA remained not physically, but in spirit. Their melodies lingered in grocery store speakers. Their lyrics engraved in the cultural memory of generations. Mamma Mia became a phenomenon. Covers, remixes, tribute bands all emerged, keeping the music alive even as the members stayed apart. But here's what's astonishing. In the year 2000, they were offered $1 billion to reunite. $1 billion. Let that settle for a moment. That's more than most countries' annual GDPs. More than the combined value of multiple major sports teams. And they turned it down. Not because of arrogance. Not because they didn't need the money. But because deep down, they knew something money couldn't erase. That coming back would mean resurrecting a version of themselves that no longer existed. They had already endured more than the public would ever know, touring while hearts were breaking, smiling while relationships collapsed, recording while the very foundation of the band crumbled beneath them. To reunite would be more than nostalgic. It would be violent. Emotionally, psychologically. It would force them to play characters in a drama that had already concluded, not with applause, but with aching silence. Still, even that wasn't the end. In 2016, ABBA did something unexpected. They announced a digital project, avatars of their younger selves, performing old hits in a new light. It wasn't a reunion. Not really. It was an echo, a holographic memorial to who they once were. No messy headlines. No vulnerable press tours. No forced nostalgia. Just 4 images frozen in time, letting the music speak while the real people quietly stayed in the background. Then in 2021, they gave the world Voyage, their first new album in 40 years. It was a strange, beautiful gesture. Not triumphant. Not sad. Just honest. The songs weren't chasing charts. They didn't scream for relevance. They felt like letters from old friends you thought you'd never hear from again. There was wisdom in those tracks, a kind of closure without confession. And while the album didn't redefine the industry, it did something far more profound. It reminded us that some stories don't need a second act. They only need a dignified ending. And maybe that's ABBA's final quiet rebellion, in a world obsessed with comebacks and redemption arcs. They didn't return for applause. They returned to say, gently, we're still here, but we're not who we were. We often expect fame to be loud. ABBA chose dignity over spectacle, introspection over reinvention. They didn't milk nostalgia. They honored it. And in doing so, they offered something rare, not just music, but emotional honesty. They showed us that you can be both successful and broken, both adored and deeply human, both legends, and quietly done. So what do we take from all this? Perhaps it's that endings don't always come with fireworks. Sometimes they arrive quietly, wrapped in harmonies, whispered between chords. Sometimes the loudest message is hidden in restraint, in not saying everything, in letting silence do the talking. Because when all is said and done, maybe ABBA's greatest act wasn't a chart-topping single or a sold-out tour. Maybe it was this, showing the world how to walk away gracefully, not because the music stopped, but because the people behind it finally needed to rest. And maybe that's a story worth hearing louder than any chorus. In the end, maybe ABBA's greatest legacy isn't just their music, but the quiet, complicated reminder that even the brightest lights cast shadows. That behind every perfect harmony might be a story no one bothered to listen to. They never asked for pity. They never asked for applause. But perhaps, deep down, they hoped someone would hear what wasn't being said. And now that you've heard it, what will you do with that silence? Thank you for staying with us until the very last note. If you believe that some truths should never stay buried, subscribe now, so you never miss a story they try to keep in the dark. See you next time. And until then, stay sharp, stay awake, and never stop questioning what lies behind the curtain.